My name is Jennifer Jackson. I am currently working for Richmond and Wandsworth Councils as Assistant Director of Planning and Transport Strategy. I have fairly minimal involvement in Rosewell inquiries. I think I've dealt with 3 so far to date, but I have got some learning from those that I would like to share.
My name is Christopher Young and I'm a barrister at number 5 Chambers, and I specialise in town and country planning work. I was involved in the first Rosewell inquiry, and since then I've been involved in 5 others in the last 6 months.
I've done 2 inquiries in the Rosewell way, and both of them have been on housing developments, quite large housing developments in different parts of the country. So the new process has brought a new perspective to the way we deal with inquiries, and for me, in my experience, I've found that particularly the pre-inquiry conference, where you can have that one-to-one discussion with the parties, has been particularly helpful because you make that early contact and you can obviously impart your initial take on the case.
In terms of the best parts of the approach so far, I think it's that speed and timeliness of decision making, which has been really good. Obviously a considerable improvement in terms of the previous processes, but also things like the case management conference approach. So even though the 2 or 3 I've experienced have involved an inspector who hasn't been the inspector who's been sitting to listen to the inquiry, the case management conference has worked really well and has worked well when it's involved all 6 parties.
Undoubtedly, the best aspect of the new approach is the speed of the process. We had a situation beforehand where planning inquiries were taking up to a year to be heard, which meant the decision was taking even longer, 13, 14 months. Now, the inquiry is listed within 16 weeks of the start date letter, and that's much better for everybody. It gives developers and local authorities and everybody else involved much greater certainty as to the time in which a decision is going to be made.
We had to find a venue for the inquiry. It couldn't be a council venue. Council meeting rooms, if you know, are always at a premium, very difficult to find. So that obviously involved the council in additional cost. And one of the things I'd particularly like to see being brought forward now is the consultation proposed in the Rosewell recommendations that the cost of inquiry venues be split between councils and appellants.
I think there is a feeling that the enthusiasm for the round table process has at times been a primary factor for some inspectors, and when your main issues are landscape and heritage, and both of those are to be dealt with by way of round table, there is a feeling that that isn't really an inquiry anymore. That's largely a hearing, albeit with opening and closing submissions and maybe cross-examination on planning. So I think there needs to be a balance between recognising certain topics will be the subject of cross-examination if they're key main issues, but perhaps not everything.
If I were doing it again, then I think for timetabling, I would have the parties create a draft timetable themselves. So if the parties take that responsibility of producing a timetable early on in the process, they take an ownership of that timetable. So when you get to the inquiry and you're starting to overrun because they're taking longer than they said they would, you're more able to go back to them and said, well, you did say you were only going to take 2 hours and we're now 4 hours into this. And so in that way, there's more ownership.
I think the topic-based statements of common ground we found particularly useful. The only advice that I would give is suggest that the appellant lodges them and then you have a fixed number of working days from that date to make your comments. We fell foul of that when the appellant didn't actually meet the time frame. It meant that we were squeezed. And then in terms of having a timetable imposed on you that's quite short, I think you will find working for a local planning authority that doesn't leave you time to procure any consultants. That's a particular challenge at the moment on one of our inquiries, that it's very specialist and we're struggling to go to a consultant within the time frame that's been imposed.
I would definitely say getting your advocates or whoever's going to present your case involved at an early stage in the process is a huge advantage. And they obviously are aware that it's important that the parties do talk to one another and try and resolve matters before they get to the inquiry, and they're more able to drive that, so that at the inquiry you're only going to be focusing on the matters in dispute, and that you're doing that in a sensible and hopefully efficient way.
As far as tips are concerned, I think one of the key issues is to recognise how important the case management conference is and to prepare for it properly. So in my case, the team will discuss well before the case management conference those topics that we think are suitable for roundtable and those which should be the subject of cross-examination. And I think you have to demonstrate that you know how the game is played. You can't insist on everything being cross-examination. That won't play well. But if you can make that decision and then perhaps send that to the inspector as a note by the programme officer a couple of days before, then the inspector can see what is going to be your position and allows the inspector to understand your position, perhaps with a bit of explanation as to why you say those topics need cross-examination and why others can be the subject of a round table.